The moneylender. In 15 years driving a taxi through the sprawling labyrinth of Mexico City, I've carried thousands of passengers, but only one truly brought me face to face with death. I still remember that night with perfect clarity. The air hung heavy with the promise of rain, the kind that never delivers but suffocates the city instead. It was nearly 3 a.m., and I was cruising through Parque Lira, hoping to catch one last fare before ending my shift. The night had been slow a Tuesday in late October, when most sensible people were home in bed. Mexico City takes on a different character after midnight. The colonial buildings cast long shadows under the sickly yellow streetlights. The perpetual traffic thins to occasional cars that appear and disappear like phantoms. In those hours, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead feels paper-thin. My grandmother would have said the veil was lifting, allowing things to slip through. I wasn't thinking about my grandmother's superstitions when I spotted the woman standing beneath the only burned-out streetlight on the avenue. From a distance, I could have sworn someone stood beside her, but when I pulled over, she was alone. She was perhaps 60, wearing a faded gray dress that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her face wore the permanent weariness of someone who had fought battles for too long. "Hospital district in Tlalpan, please," she said as she climbed into the back seat. Her voice was soft, but carried an unnatural weight that made the hairs on my neck stand up. "It's quite late for a hospital visit, Senora," I said, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. In this job, you learn quickly that everyone has their reasons, and few want to share them with a stranger. "Time means little when it's running out," she replied, cryptically settling back into the seat. I nodded, switched on the meter, and pulled away from the curb. The streets were unusually empty even for this hour. Normally, you'd encounter at least some signs of life: late-night workers, early-morning vendors setting up young people stumbling home from clubs. But that night, the city seemed to be holding its breath. As we passed Televisa San Angel, I noticed in my rearview mirror that the woman was shifting uncomfortably. With visible effort, she moved directly behind me. I thought nothing of it at first. Passengers often have their seating preferences. But then I felt something press against my seat, her knees pushing with an insistent pressure. I glanced in the mirror again, and my heart nearly stopped. She was no longer alone. Sitting beside her was my Aunt Mariana, my father's sister, who had raised me for 14 years after my parents died in a bus accident when I was 9. But Mariana had passed away 5 years ago from heart failure. I blinked hard and looked again. The resemblance was unmistakable. Her round face, the mole above her right eyebrow, the way she folded her hands in her lap. It couldn't be, yet there she was, looking exactly as she had the last time I saw her alive. "Are you all right, driver?" the woman asked, noticing my distraction. "Yes, senora, I'm fine," I lied, forcing my eyes back to the road. My pulse hammered in my temples and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. "I'm just tired," I told myself. "My mind is playing tricks after too many late shifts," but I couldn't stop myself from looking in the mirror again and again. Each time I saw Mariana sitting there, her eyes warm and familiar, that slight smile on her lips, the one she'd wear when she knew I was hiding something. When I had to leave the central lanes to head toward our destination, I gathered my courage and turned to look over my shoulder, pretending to check for traffic. In the back seat sat only the elderly woman, no one else. I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me. But when I checked the mirror again, Mariana had returned. "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question tumbled from my mouth before I could stop it, my throat dry as sandpaper. The woman hesitated, first saying no, then yes. "Why do you ask?" she inquired, her tone suddenly alert. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. "I don't mean to alarm you, but I keep seeing my aunt in the mirror. She's sitting right next to you." I expected fear, surprise, perhaps even anger at my strange confession. Instead, the woman looked calmly to her right, then back to me. No hint of shock crossed her face. "It's not your aunt," she whispered, leaning forward over the seat. In that instant, the face I thought was Mariana's transformed in the mirror. The warm, familiar features melted away, revealing an ancient man with skin as pale as bone, deeply sunken eyes, and a calculating stare that seemed to dissect my soul. "That's el prestamista," the woman murmured. "The moneylender." The name sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the night air. I'd heard stories of El Prestamista since childhood, whispered tales exchanged between my grandmother and her friends, always after the children were supposed to be asleep. He was one of death's many faces in Mexican folklore, neither Santa Muerte nor the Grim Reaper, but something uniquely ours, a businessman who dealt in years rather than pesos. We were approaching the hospital now. I pulled up to the entrance, my hands trembling on the wheel. The woman exited without another word. I remained in the taxi watching her walk slowly toward the hospital doors. No one else left my vehicle, but when I checked the back seat to be certain it was completely empty. El prestamista, I whispered each syllable, freezing in the air between us. For days afterward that name echoed in my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on my work. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see that ancient face staring back at me. A week later, I finally told my story to Jorge, a fellow taxi driver who'd been working these streets for 30 years. "You've met El Prestamista," Jorge said, his face draining of color. "That's not a good sign, Manuel." We were parked at our usual spot near the Zocalo, sharing coffee from a thermos between fares. The morning bustle of the city continued around us, oblivious to our conversation about death incarnate. "What exactly is he?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. Jorge glanced around nervously before answering, as if El Prestamista might be listening. "He's one of death's manifestations, not death itself, but a collector. They say he appears when someone's time is almost up." "But why did he look like my aunt at first?" Jorge shrugged. "He takes familiar forms sometimes, especially of those who've already crossed over. It makes people more willing to listen, to trust." He paused, sipping his coffee. "My grandmother used to say, El Prestamista offers deals, time, health opportunities in exchange for years of life. When the debt comes due, he appears to collect. But why was he with that woman in my taxi?" Jorge looked at me with eyes heavy with ancestral knowledge. "If El Prestamista was traveling with her, then she must have borrowed something from him. Time maybe, or health, or a chance. But whatever the case, Manuel, her bill was coming due." I shivered despite the morning heat. "And my aunt, why did he appear as her?" Jorge's expression darkened. "Did she die before her time? Sudden illness, accident?" "Heart failure," I said. "The doctor said it was unexpected for someone her age." Jorge nodded slowly. "Perhaps she was offered a deal, once more time with you maybe, and refused. El Prestamista doesn't like being refused." The thought lodged in my chest like a shard of ice. Had Mariana been offered more time and turned it down? Had she chosen to leave rather than make a deal with this entity? 2 weeks after my encounter, I was reading the newspaper over breakfast when a small obituary caught my eye. Elena Fuentes, 62, had passed away at a hospital in Tlalpan after a long battle with cancer. The accompanying photo confirmed what I already knew: she was my passenger that night. What haunted me most, however, was another detail in the article. Elena had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 2 years earlier, with doctors giving her 6 months to live at most. Yet somehow she had survived for 2 years, long enough to see her first grandchild born. That evening I found myself drawn to the hospital where I had dropped her off. Something compelled me to visit the chapel in the hospital's quiet corner. Inside, a memorial display held photos of recently departed patients. Among them was a larger photo of Elena taken in her hospital room shortly before she passed. My blood froze when I examined it closely. In the corner of the room, reflected in the mirror on her bedside table, stood a tall, gaunt figure, and beside him, like a shadow, was the unmistakable silhouette of my Aunt Mariana. After that discovery, strange occurrences began plaguing me. I'd find coins in my taxi that I hadn't placed there, old coins that aren't in circulation anymore. Sometimes I'd hear tapping on the rear windows when no one was there. the radio would switch to static, through which I could almost make out my aunt's voice whispering my name. Last night, as I started my shift, I noticed an old man standing on the corner staring directly at me. His eyes were deep set, his skin pulled tight over prominent cheekbones. When I looked in my rearview mirror, Aunt Mariana sat in the back seat, her expression no longer warm, but filled with sorrow. "He's coming for you, Manuel," she said, her voice distant as if carried from another world, "just as he came for me, just as he came for Elena." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because debts must be paid," she replied. "Elena borrowed time to see her grandchild. I refused to borrow time even though it meant leaving you. And now—" Her voice faded. "And now what?" I demanded, turning to face the empty back seat. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. This morning I woke to find an ancient coin on my nightstand, a silver piece that hasn't been in circulation for a century. Beneath it was a small handwritten note that I don't remember writing, "All debts come due. Tonight is my last shift. I don't know what will happen, but I sense El Prestamista waiting for me somewhere in the labyrinthine streets of Mexico City. Perhaps he'll offer me a deal as well. Perhaps he already has in some moment I've forgotten, and now he's come to collect. So let me offer this warning. If you're ever in a taxi late at night in Mexico City and hear tapping on the window, don't look in the rearview mirror. If your driver seems distracted, staring at the back seat when you're the only passenger, ask to be let out at the next corner. And if you see an elderly man with sunken eyes and a face like ancient parchment waiting at a bus stop or street corner after midnight, keep walking. Not all who offer to help you reach your destination have your best interests at heart. Some are simply collecting what they're owed. Last week I visited my aunt's grave for the first time in years. I left flowers and whispered an apology for not understanding her choice. As I turned to leave, I saw a silver coin resting atop her headstone, identical to the one that had appeared on my nightstand. When I reached to take it, I heard a voice behind me. "Some debts can be inherited, Manuel." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew who or what was standing there. I simply asked, "How much time do I have?" "That depends," came the reply, "on what you're willing to pay." I still drive my taxi every night looking for passengers heading to the hospital district. I still see my aunt in the rearview mirror, sometimes her eyes filled with warning. And occasionally I pick up passengers who seem to know me, who ask if I've made my decision yet. Time, they say, is the most precious currency, and in the ledger of El Prestamista every second is accounted for. What would you pay for another day, another year, another chance? Because in the end we all have debts to settle, and El Prestamista always collects what he's owed. Closed cases. I remember clearly the first time I heard this story. It was a Sunday afternoon and I was 14 years old. We were on summer vacation and had just returned from buying school supplies downtown for the upcoming term. When we arrived home, my father encountered an old friend changing a tire on the street. My mother and I went inside. We were tired from the shopping trip, and I fell asleep on the couch while they remained outside talking for hours. I woke up at nightfall for dinner. At the table, my father shared what his friend had just confided in him. The man, Officer Alejandro Morales, had been a police officer in 1996, but resigned from the force 2 years later. The reason, an emergency response that marked him for life. What I heard that Sunday evening remained deeply etched in my mind. So much so that whenever I watched a horror movie afterward, I inevitably thought that what had happened to my father's friend was far worse than anything shown in those films. Daniel, my father, began using my name in that serious tone that meant a remarkable story was coming. Alejandro told me something today that I've never heard before, not in all my years. He glanced at my mother, who nodded slightly, giving permission to continue despite my young age. One night, Officer Morales was patrolling the outskirts of Tlalnepantla municipality. My father continued. His patrol car's lights were flashing, and he was driving slowly. According to him, it would have been 2 or 3 in the morning. My father wouldn't tell me the exact location, but from his description, when we were driving around, I formed a mental picture. I believe I've even been there once when we visited an aunt. My father took a brief detour to show me a street with an empty lot and old abandoned buildings. Officer Morales turned a corner and found a boy in the middle of the block, my father continued. The child was raising his arms, waving them to attract attention. Unfortunately for Morales, he was the first to cross the boy's path and respond. The boy was asking for help finding his grandfather. Through tears, he explained that he'd been alone since that afternoon, when the old man had entered a place from which he hadn't returned. Morales got out of his patrol car, took his flashlight, and followed the child into an unkempt, vacant lot, reclaimed by vegetation. It was a rather large property with no visible construction, containing only a path that cut through the middle, leading to a tall cinder-block wall. On the ground at the end of the lot was a concrete cube with doors, the entrance to an underground basement. The officer expected anything but that. Opening the doors proved difficult. When Morales removed the bar and lifted the metal plates, a powerful stench emerged, a mixture of dust, dampness, rotting leaves, and hints of decomposing matter. "When you say your grandfather disappeared, are you sure he's in there?" the officer asked, illuminating his flashlight down the opening. The boy merely nodded, his eyes wide with what Morales initially took for fear. Morales descended 10 stone steps. Almost at the precise moment he called out to ask who had closed the hatch on the old man, he heard a thunderous noise from above. The doors had fallen shut. Then came the sound of the metal bar sliding across them. Morales didn't understand immediately. He told my father he thought it was a prank. He tried to climb back up to the surface but couldn't. He pounded on the doors, but no one responded. Perhaps no one could hear him. According to his recollection, there were abandoned, unfinished buildings to the left and right of the property. He continued pushing and struggling with the doors, but only after a while did he comprehend what had happened. He had been tricked into entering that hole only to be locked inside. "But why?" I interrupted my father. "Why would someone do that?" "That's exactly what Alejandro asked himself," my father replied. "It made no sense." Why him? Why a police officer? The immediate darkness concealed the basement's interior, but answers lay scattered throughout. The flashlight helped Morales explore his surroundings. At the bottom of the stairs was a small chamber with a metal chair, a table, and a typewriter covered in dust. On one wall was a metal window that, like the entrance doors, could only be opened from the other side. Beyond this space stretched a narrow corridor with a low ceiling and walls that grew closer together as one progressed. To traverse it completely, one had to stoop in certain sections. Initially, Morales didn't venture far, thinking that if someone came to open the doors, he should be nearby to escape. But then he checked his time, not yet 4 a.m. At that hour, there would likely be no one interested in rescuing a police officer locked in some underground bunker. The abandoned patrol car on the street, the silent radio locator, his absence at the end of his shift, his family noticing he hadn't come home, all would eventually raise alarms, but that could take hours. After his second attempt to navigate the claustrophobic passageway, he reached a new chamber. A headless Virgin Mary statue decorated the center of the room. As soon as the officer illuminated the statue's feet, he found something horrifying, a mummified body leaning against it. The rest of the chamber was decorated with torches and consumed candles. There were niches, drawers, altars, pews for prayer, a baptismal font, and more bodies, all in various states of mummification, some appearing centuries old, others more recent. The relative calm with which the officer had maintained himself until that moment vanished suddenly. There was a real possibility he might never see daylight again. In fact, there was little distinguishing him from the other prisoners of that basement. Terrified, he ran back to the staircase and pounded on the hatch doors. Though no light filtered through the cracks, he could tell it was dawning outside, because the metal felt warm to the touch. When he returned to the chamber with the statue, he noticed a door he had overlooked in his panic. He searched for a stone to break the lock or whatever kept it secured, but it wasn't necessary. All that kept the door attached to the frame was a sign reading, "Do not open." Could this be the exit? Or would it lead deeper into this horrible basement to a section even more difficult to escape from? Morales said he opened the door and propped against it a stone cross he had found in the chamber. He knew that if this door closed, he would be even further from the main entrance, his chances of escape approaching zero. A new staircase, a new corridor, and an even larger chamber awaited. With his flashlight, he illuminated a wall covered with barrels, 2 empty shelves, a chest, and a pile of discarded school chairs. Here, too, was another door bearing a similar warning, "Do not open." Morales blocked this second door with one of the chairs from the pile. The third corridor was the longest and darkest, though not the narrowest. At its end, Officer Morales found a kind of bedroom with mirrors, tables, wardrobes, coat racks, chairs, and sofas covered with sheets. Every thought related to the creation and existence of that hole was sinister, to say the least. Why would someone construct such a place? Why would someone trick a police officer into entering it? The sign on the final door was the least deceptive exit. When Morales passed through that door, he found a chamber with a sarcophagus in the center. No sooner had he pointed his light toward it than its contents stirred and the lid began to rise. The officer immediately closed the door and hurried back up level by level. He remained in the last chamber, considering his options. Meanwhile, he pondered the purpose of this underground complex. There were candles and means to light them scattered around. People who, like him, had been trapped in these chambers could have explored the subsequent levels. Some surely reached the end where whatever was inside that box had fed on them. Morales spent more than a day pounding on the hatch without success. Only the following night did a pair of police officers open the doors and free him. It wasn't his abandoned patrol car that saved him, that was found weeks later in a ravine. It wasn't his pounding that alerted anyone to his imprisonment. It was pure coincidence. When he entered the property, a woman looking through her window had seen him disappear into the dry vegetation. She had previously observed the same pattern. A child or young person would alert any passerby near at those hours, lead them to the back of the property, and they would never be seen again. As soon as Morales received medical attention, authorities closed off the property to conduct an investigation. No one ever determined what had been in the final chamber, but the theories I've considered over the years lead me to believe in cryptids inhabiting the Earth's interior and creatures that feed on humans. At 4 a.m. that same morning, someone dynamited the underground complex. The explosion shook the surroundings. Until that moment, neighbors didn't even know that their street concealed a passageway and catacombs guarding dark secrets. Word spread, but everything remained just rumors. When the underground construction collapsed, the investigation made little progress. Case closed, as my father always said when finishing his friend's story. To this day, I can't stop thinking about what might inhabit the subsoil beneath our cities. I can't forget the idea that implanted itself in my mind years ago. Who was that boy who sent him? Who was that adult? How many other people had been tricked and led into those basements? Where else might such hatches exist? And above all, what was about to emerge from the sarcophagus when the officer entered the final chamber? 20 years have passed since that Sunday evening when my father shared this story. I followed in Officer Morales' footsteps, becoming a police officer myself, though my father initially objected, perhaps remembering his friend's experience. Last month I was assigned night patrol in Tlalnepantla, near the area where Morales had his encounter. The district has changed significantly. New developments, shopping centers, and apartment buildings have replaced many of the abandoned properties. But some corners remain untouched, forgotten by time and progress. On my third night of patrol, around 3 a.m., I noticed a small figure standing beneath a streetlight on a quiet corner. As I approached, I could see it was a boy, perhaps 10 years old, with an unnaturally pale face. He raised his arms when he saw the patrol car, frantically waving. I stopped, rolled down the window, and asked what was wrong. "Please, officer, you have to help me," the boy said, his voice oddly measured despite his apparent distress. "My grandfather went into a place this afternoon and hasn't come out. I've been waiting for hours." A chill ran through me as I remembered my father's story. "Where is this place?" I asked, my hand instinctively moving to the holster at my side. The boy pointed toward an empty lot between two modern buildings. "Back there. There's a path that leads to some doors in the ground." I radioed for backup before stepping out of the car. "What's your name?" I asked the child. "Miguel," he answered, his eyes reflecting the streetlight in a way that seemed almost luminous. "And your grandfather's name?" The boy hesitated. "Alejandro," he finally said. "Alejandro Morales." My blood froze. That was the name of my father's friend, the officer from the original story. He would be in his 70s now, but as far as I knew, he had moved away from Mexico City decades ago after his experience. "Wait by the car," I told the boy. "My partners will be here soon." But when I looked back after taking only a few steps, the boy was gone. I scanned the area with my flashlight, calling out, but received no response. The backup units arrived minutes later, and together we approached the vacant lot. There, just as the boy had described, we found a concrete cube with metal doors, a basement entrance that should not have existed in this newly developed area. The doors were secured with a heavy bar that looked decades old, rusted but solid. Against my colleague's advice, I insisted on opening it. The same stench that Morales had described wafted up from below: dust, dampness, decay. We descended with weapons drawn and powerful flashlights illuminating our way. At the bottom, we found exactly what had been described to me years ago: a small chamber with a metal chair and table and the dust-covered typewriter. On the wall was the metal window, and beyond the narrow corridor leading deeper. We should wait for forensics, one of my partners suggested, but curiosity drove me forward. I needed to know if what my father had told me was true, if what waited at the end was still there. We moved through the complex, finding each chamber just as described: the room with the headless Virgin Mary statue, the pews, the niches filled with mummified remains. Some appeared ancient, while others seemed more recent. Each door bore the same warning: "Do not open." In the final chamber, before the door marked "Exit," I hesitated. My colleagues waited behind me, uncertain. "We've come this far," I said, more to myself than to them. I pushed open the door, revealing the room with the sarcophagus at its center. It was just as my father had described, down to the faded hieroglyphs etched into its stone surface. The lid was closed. "Should we?" one officer asked, gesturing toward the sarcophagus. Before I could respond, a voice echoed from the entrance far above. "Officer Delgado, there's someone here who wants to speak with you." We retreated through the complex, returning to the surface where my sergeant stood with an elderly man I had never seen before. He was thin, with deeply lined features and haunted eyes. "This gentleman says he knows about this place," my sergeant explained. "Says he was trapped down there decades ago." The old man looked at me with recognition, though we had never met. "You're Gabriel's son," he said. "You look just like him." "Alejandro Morales?" I asked, stunned. He nodded. "Your father told you my story. I can see it in your eyes." But the boy said, "What boy?" Morales interrupted, his expression darkening. "A child who flagged me down. He said his grandfather was named Alejandro Morales and had gone into this basement." The old man's face drained of what little color it had. "There was never any child," he whispered. "That's how it lures you in. That's how it's always lured people in. The thing in the sarcophagus, it creates these apparitions, these lures." "But we've sealed all the underground complexes in this area," my sergeant interjected. "This one shouldn't even exist anymore." "It always finds a way back," Morales said. "It's been here since before the Spanish arrived. The Aztecs knew about it. They built temples over its entrances, performed sacrifices to keep it satisfied. When the conquistadors came, they built churches on those same spots. But underneath, it's always been underneath." As if to punctuate his words, a low rumble emanated from the basement entrance. The ground trembled slightly beneath our feet. "Close it," Morales urged. "Close it and collapse it just like before." We did as he suggested, sealing the entrance and calling in a construction crew to pour concrete over the site. Before leaving, Morales pulled me aside. "It won't stay buried forever," he said quietly. "It never does. And when it returns, it will remember you, Officer Delgado. It remembers everyone who's seen it and escaped." "What exactly is it?" I asked. "The conquistadors called it El Devorador, the Devourer. The Aztecs had another name for it, one I can't pronounce. But they all understood what it was, something ancient, something hungry, something patient." As Morales turned to leave, he pressed something cold and metallic into my palm. "Carry this. It won't save you, but it might give you time if you ever encounter it again." I looked down at a small amulet intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. 2 weeks later, I was called to the precinct captain's office. On his desk lay a file marked "Case Closed." "You filed a report about an underground complex in Tlalnepantla," he said without preamble. "Yes, sir. There's no record of any Alejandro Morales ever serving on the force. The construction crew you requested found nothing but solid earth at the coordinates you provided, and this amulet you submitted as evidence." He held up a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be a small, ordinary stone. "It's just a rock, Delgado. But, sir, your father has no record of any friend by that name either. We checked." I left his office in a daze. That night I called my father. "Dad, do you remember telling me about your friend Alejandro Morales, the police officer who was trapped in an underground basement?" There was a long pause on the line. "I don't know anyone by that name, son. The story you told me when I was 14 about the boy who lured him into the basement with all the mummified bodies." Another pause, longer this time. "Gabriel, are you feeling all right? I never told you any such story." After hanging up, I sat in the dark of my apartment trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I imagined everything created an elaborate fiction from some half-remembered nightmare? A knock at my door startled me. Through the peephole, I saw a young boy standing in the hallway, the same boy who had flagged me down that night. "Officer Delgado," he called, his voice eerily adult. "I need your help. My grandfather is missing." I backed away from the door, heart pounding. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. "We remember you, Officer Delgado." The voice said no longer childlike at all. "We remember everyone who's seen us and escaped. I haven't returned to that neighborhood since." I requested a transfer to a different district, which was granted without question. But sometimes, on quiet nights during patrol, I hear a child calling for help, and I have to fight the urge to respond. Yesterday, a new case file appeared on my desk. A fellow officer had gone missing during night patrol in Tlalnepantla. His last radio communication mentioned a boy waving for help on a street corner. By the time backup arrived, both the officer and the boy were gone. The only evidence found was a small stone amulet lying in the street, covered in symbols no one could identify. The case was marked "Open" in bold red letters. But I know better. Some cases never truly close. They just wait beneath the surface, patient and hungry for someone new to come looking. Settling accounts. I started driving a taxi that my father-in-law lent me. Not immediately, but one day, I discovered that this car actually belonged to a young man who owed him a lot of money. After some time, my father-in-law finally took the car as payment for the debt, painted it the official yellow color, and put it to work at a local taxi stand. I knew about this because a colleague, Miguel, warned me that he had seen Ricardo, the car's former owner, hanging around the neighborhood. Miguel advised me to be careful because Ricardo might still have a spare key and could visit the car at any time. I wasn't particularly concerned. This was an issue between Ricardo and my father-in-law, not my business. Once I mentioned it to my father-in-law, who said he would handle the matter, but after that I heard nothing more about it. The taxi business in Mexico City is challenging at the best of times. The endless sprawl means long hours, brutal traffic, and the constant threat of robbery or worse. Most nights I returned home exhausted, my back aching from hours hunched over the wheel, my mind numb from the constant vigilance required to navigate both the chaotic streets and the equally unpredictable passengers. It was getting dark one night, and I was in the Santa Fe area, the zone of corporate buildings. I was ready to head home, but first wanted to find a place to buy some oil for the car. For convenience, I pulled into a nearby supermarket. When I entered the parking lot, I found it nearly empty. Nevertheless, I parked far from the entrance so I could smoke a cigarette and stretch my legs. I exited the car and walked straight ahead, stepping on the lines that formed the parking spaces. About halfway to the store, I heard a car alarm go off. It had to be my taxi since it was the only vehicle parked behind me. I quickly turned around, and indeed, my car's lights were flashing in sync with the alarm. I didn't need to wonder what had triggered it. Beside the driver's door stood a man. I hurried back, wanting to confront whoever was trying to break into my vehicle. As I approached, I saw him walk to the back of the taxi, bend down behind the trunk, and vanish from my sight. The first thing I did was verify that all doors were locked. Then I circled the vehicle looking for the man, but couldn't find him anywhere. I even looked under the car and between the wheels, but there was no one to be seen. I remained leaning against one side of the car for a few minutes to finish my cigarette, continuously scanning my surroundings, but still couldn't spot the man, although I noticed several places where he could have hidden. After a few minutes, I stubbed out my cigarette and began walking toward the supermarket. Before going, I considered moving the taxi closer to the entrance, but then decided to walk slowly and wait to see if the man would reappear. I did exactly that. Halfway there, the alarm sounded again. Hearing the alarm, I immediately ran back. This time, from a distance, I could see the driver's door was open. I reached the taxi but found it empty, with no one in the vicinity either. Once again I stood waiting, hoping to see the man return, but instead decided to get in the car and leave the parking lot. I paid the ticket at the booth and accelerated onto the avenue. Just as I picked up speed, a voice from behind me said, "Weren't you going to buy something?" I jerked the steering wheel but fortunately didn't lose control. What frightened me most at that moment was that when I looked at the back seat, I saw no one there. I tried to calm myself. Perhaps I had misheard. Maybe it was the radio or noise from another car. I turned off the radio and lowered the window slightly, listening. Nothing, just the wind and the sound of the engine. I drove for a few more minutes, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The back seat remained empty. Surely I had misheard. I sighed with relief. A red light ahead forced me to stop. I took the opportunity to check my phone. Just then I felt something touch my shoulder. I spun around but still saw no one. However, I felt the back seat depress as if someone were sitting there. "Weren't you going to buy something?" The voice repeated, clearer this time. It sounded like a young man, but something was off, as if it came from very far away or through a layer of water. I couldn't move. Cold sweat ran down my spine. The light had turned green, but I couldn't press the accelerator. "Ricardo?" I asked, my voice trembling. No answer came, but I felt the temperature in the car suddenly drop. My breath formed small clouds in front of me. The honking of a car behind forced me to continue driving. I pressed the gas, trying not to look in the rearview mirror anymore. I needed to get home, or at least to a crowded place. I pulled into a gas station nearby where there were people and lights. I didn't dare turn off the engine or exit the car. Instead, I called Miguel. "Miguel, I think Ricardo's in my car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You saw him?" Miguel asked. "No, but I heard him, and I feel, something in the back seat." Miguel was silent for a moment. "Do you know Ricardo died 3 months ago?" My heart nearly stopped. "What? Your father-in-law didn't tell you Ricardo was stabbed in a bar fight. That's why he took the car Ricardo's family couldn't pay the debt." My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. "Why didn't you tell me? I thought you knew." Miguel paused. Listen, there's something about that car you should know. Ricardo loved that car. He even lived in it when he couldn't afford rent, and he died in that car. What? I whispered. That's why your father-in-law could take the car so easily. No one wanted it after what happened. He repainted it, cleaned the interior, even replaced the seats, but what? People say Ricardo's soul is still attached to the car. Some drivers who drove it before you reported strange things, voices, objects, moving sudden temperature drops. I looked at the back seat again, still empty, but now I noticed a large, damp patch on the seat shaped like a person. I'll come to you, Miguel said. Don't move. As I waited, I pulled out the medallion of St. Christopher my mother had given me when I first started driving taxis. I clutched it tightly, praying for protection. In Mexico, we grow up with stories of restless souls of spirits tied to places and objects. The Day of the Dead isn't just a colorful festival, it's an acknowledgement that the boundary between our world and the next is thinner than most care to admit. My thoughts were interrupted by movement in the rearview mirror. For an instant I saw a face, reflected there a young man with sad eyes and a deep cut across his throat. It's not your fault, a voice whispered from the back seat. But I can't leave. This is my home, and now you're part of it too. When Miguel arrived 15 minutes later, he found me sitting motionless in the car, drenched in sweat, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. And on the back seat a damp patch was spreading dark red like blood. That night Miguel drove me home in his own taxi. Following behind was another friend towing my vehicle. I couldn't bring myself to sit in it again. As we drove, Miguel explained what he had learned about Ricardo and my father-in-law. Your father-in-law was involved with some dangerous people, he said quietly. Ricardo borrowed money to start a business, but when he couldn't pay, your father-in-law arranged for him to have an accident. The official story was a bar fight, but everyone at the taxi stand knows the truth. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, still shaking. Your father-in-law is not someone people cross, Miguel replied, and most assumed you knew that you were part of it. I wasn't part of anything. I was just a man trying to make a living, caught in something I didn't understand. But now I did, and the knowledge weighed on me like a stone. The next morning I confronted my father-in-law. He denied everything, of course, but I could see the truth in his eyes, the cold calculation, the dismissal of a human life as merely a business transaction gone wrong. I quit driving the taxi that day. My father-in-law demanded it back, but I refused. Instead, I parked it in front of our small apartment, where it has remained for the past week untouched. Each morning I find the car in a different position than where I left it. Sometimes the engine is warm to the touch, as if it's been driven during the night. Neighbors report seeing it cruising the streets in the early hours, though no one can describe the driver. Yesterday I found a note on the windshield written in unfamiliar handwriting, "There are more debts to be paid." Last night I woke to the sound of the taxi's engine starting. From my window I watched it pull away from the curb, no one visible behind the wheel. It returned an hour later, and when I summoned the courage to go check it, I found my father-in-law's watch on the front seat, the same watch he was wearing when I saw him earlier that day. I called his cell phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. This morning, police found his car abandoned near the ravine where Ricardo's body was discovered 3 months ago. Of my father-in-law, there was no sign, just a large blood stain on the driver's seat of his car. The police questioned me, of course. I told them nothing about Ricardo or the taxi. What could I say that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman? Tonight, as I write this, the taxi sits outside my window again. Its engine occasionally revs, though no one is inside. I've packed my belongings and will leave at first light, heading to my mother's village far from Mexico City. I don't know if distance will matter to something that isn't bound by physical laws, but I have to try. If you're ever in Mexico City and hail a yellow taxi, check the license plate carefully. If it ends in 729, find another ride. And if your driver seems distracted, constantly looking in the rearview mirror at an empty back seat, ask to be let out immediately, no matter where you are. Some debts can never be fully paid, and some journeys have destinations we never intended to reach. As I prepare to leave, I hear a knock at my door. Through the peephole, I see no one, but on the floor lies a familiar key, the key to the taxi I've been avoiding. Attached is a note in the same unfamiliar handwriting. Every passenger reaches their destination eventually. I think I've been a passenger all along, never the driver, and now my fare is coming due. The intruder. It was very late or very early, depending on how you look at it. The clock indicated just past 2 in the morning, and we were patrolling through the quiet streets of the district. I'm Officer Lorenzo Ramirez, working with my colleague Carlos Mendoza for over 3 years now. We received a call from dispatch center. A woman reported a home invasion and robbery. We were the closest unit, so we immediately headed to the provided address. According to the female citizen, a male subject had broken into her home while she and her daughter were sleeping each in their respective rooms. The intruder had allegedly broken a window pane to open the window and enter. I still remember the strange feeling when we received this call, not because of its content, which was unfortunately common enough in our line of work, but because of the woman's voice. Something felt off, too calm, yet simultaneously too frantic. When we arrived, a woman around 30 years old was waiting outside. She couldn't stand still, appearing anxious and horrified. She ran to the patrol car, pulled my door, trying to help me out, urging us to quickly enter the house to help her daughter, who was allegedly being held captive in her own room by a stranger. We crossed a wide yard, up a couple of steps, and entered the house. As soon as we were inside, we heard banging, crashing, and screams coming from upstairs. We rushed up the stairs, and at the top, at the beginning of a wide hallway, the mother pointed to a door. It was a large colonial-style house with a courtyard fountain, large windows, and tall trees. The interiors were also spacious, with light from chandeliers hanging from the ceilings, casting dim illumination. Only these 2 people lived in this house, which seemed to lack adequate security. Before proceeding, we asked the woman if the intruder was armed, but she answered that she didn't know, that she hadn't seen him clearly. My colleague Carlos announced our presence. We had to be extremely cautious to avoid tragedy, especially since we didn't have a clear idea of what was happening in the bedroom. From inside, we could hear the girls' muffled screams, followed by banging against the walls. We feared the intruder might be harming the girls, so we decided to enter. We were prepared to break down the door if necessary, but when we tried to turn the handle, it opened without difficulty. We caught a glimpse of what was inside, but only for a split second, because the moment we pushed the door completely open, all lights went out: the bedroom light, the hallway light, even the exterior lights. In that brief moment, we saw a figure with strange proportions embracing a young girl by the neck. Both were kneeling, and there was something wrong about the way they moved, too jerky, too unnatural. As I mentioned, the lights went out and we could no longer see anything. The woman ran to try turning on the nearest light, but there seemed to be no electricity. Carlos pulled out his flashlight but couldn't turn it on. Suddenly, in front of us, just a few steps away, a horrifying laugh erupted. It was the laugh of the man we had glimpsed seconds before, a terrifying face with sunken eyes, prominent dark circles, a chilling gaze, and a sinister smile. Immediately afterward, we also heard the girl laughing. We wanted to believe it was nervous laughter or from desperation, but it wasn't. It sounded like mocking laughter, as if we were the subjects of a cruel joke. The lights came back on a few seconds later. To our surprised and frightened eyes, only the girl appeared. There was no one else in the room. From what we could see, the intruder must have hidden under the bed or in the closet, as it was impossible to exit through the door or windows. There was something strange about this house, and we were just beginning to realize it. The woman knew there was no intruder. There are always signs when a home is broken into, traces of destruction. When we arrived, there was no broken glass, no forced window, nothing that the woman had reported. In that bedroom, there was only the girl, no one else. We came to this conclusion because when the lights came on, she was in an inexplicable contortion. She remained kneeling, but now had her entire back-arched forehead touching the floor, looking at us while smiling. We backed away, terrified. The woman asked us to do something for her daughter, but we also didn't know what to do. Truthfully, we didn't want to enter the room. The only way to explain the feeling was as if there were an invisible barrier preventing us from entering. At the back of the room on a cream-colored wall was a drawing that stretched from floor to ceiling. It was created with red wax depicting the same man we had seen when opening the door minutes earlier. The drawing was not human-like. The lines were too sharp, too detailed, too alive. The face had demonic features and seemed to be something not entirely human. The drawing appeared to be watching us, following us. We tried talking to the girl as a last resort, but received no answer. We asked the mother if she needed medical assistance, if she knew whether her daughter had abused any substance, or if she suffered from any illness. We left with many unanswered questions. The only thing we couldn't erase from our minds was that we had witnessed a demonic possession. Before we decided to leave, the girl regained her normal posture. Her vertebrae cracked as she stood up, wished her mother good night, and closed her bedroom door. We remained outside the house for the rest of the early morning, but no further assistance was requested. Moreover, the woman refused to allow an ambulance to examine the girl. "That's all we know about the incident," Carlos concluded, looking at me with heavy eyes. Months later, a for sale sign appeared at the main gate. From the time I tell you this story until now, the word for sale remains in front of that house. I couldn't help but feel chilled hearing the story. As an investigative journalist specializing in supernatural phenomena, I had heard many stories, but this one had something different, truth evident in every word. "Is there anything else you haven't told me?" I asked, sensing Carlos was holding something back. Carlos looked down at his glass, turning it in his hand. About a year later, I received a call from a colleague at the police department. He had been investigating the history of that house. It turns out, before the mother and daughter moved in, the house had been vacant for nearly a decade. The last owner was a Jesuit missionary who had attempted to perform an exorcism there and failed. Failed how? He was found dead in the master bedroom, the same room where we saw the girl with his body contorted in an unimaginable way. On the wall behind him was a drawing in his blood of a creature with sunken eyes and a terrible smile. Carlos looked directly into my eyes. And here's the strangest part, something I haven't dared tell anyone else. 2 months after that incident, I started seeing it in my dreams, that same creature. And recently I've started seeing it when I'm awake. I began feeling uncomfortable. What do you mean? Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I don't see my face. Instead, I see it, the sunken eyes, the wide smile, and it's drawing something on the wall, in blood, a list of names, names of people I've told this story to. My heart pounded. "Why are you telling me this then?" Carlos smiled, but it wasn't the smile I'd seen earlier. This was wider, unnatural. His eyes seemed to sink deeper into their sockets. "Because it needs more names," Carlos said, his voice no longer his own. "And yours has just been added to the list." I laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the tension. "Good one, Carlos. You almost had me there." But Carlos didn't laugh. He just stared at me with that unsettling smile. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. In the small bathroom of the cafe where we'd been talking, I splashed cold water on my face. When I looked up at the mirror, I expected to see my own reflection. Instead, I saw a face with sunken eyes and a wide, unnatural smile. Not Carlos's face, not my face, but the face from his story. The reflection's hand moved, drawing something on the mirror in what looked like blood. Names appeared one after another, and at the bottom, freshly written, was my own name. I stumbled back from the mirror, nearly falling. When I looked again, my normal reflection stared back, pale and frightened. I took several deep breaths before returning to our table. Carlos was gone. In his place sat a young woman in a cream-colored dress. When she saw me, she smiled the same unnatural smile. "He had to leave," she said in a voice that wasn't quite right. "But he wanted me to give you this." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was a child's drawing done in red crayon, a crude representation of a house with 4 figures standing outside, 2 stick figures in police uniforms, a woman and a girl with an impossibly arched back. In the window of the house was a face with sunken eyes and a wide smile. At the bottom, in childish handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for listening to our story. Now you're part of it too." When I looked up, the woman was gone. The waitress approached, looking concerned. "Are you all right, sir? You've been sitting alone, talking to yourself for over an hour?" I paid my bill and left quickly, the drawing clutched in my hand. Outside dusk had fallen, and the street lights were coming on one by one. As I walked to my car, I passed a darkened shop front. In the reflection of the window, I saw myself walking, but I wasn't alone. Behind me followed a figure with sunken eyes and a wide smile. I haven't slept much since that day. Sometimes I wake to find red marks on my bathroom mirror, names that fade by morning. Sometimes I hear laughter in empty rooms. And sometimes when I'm interviewing subjects for my articles on supernatural phenomena, I catch them looking at me with sudden fear, as if seeing something behind me or within me. Last week, I received a real estate listing in my email, a colonial-style house with a courtyard and fountain. The subject line read, "Your new home is waiting for you." I deleted it immediately, but each morning it reappears in my inbox unread. I'm writing this story now because I need someone else to know someone else to share this burden. I'm sorry if that sounds selfish, but the drawing has changed. Now, there are 5 figures outside the house, 2 officers, a woman, a girl, and a journalist. And there's space for one more. Sweet dreams. David. I've been working with the ride-sharing platform for several years. In all that time, I've completed over 30,000 trips officially recorded by the application. My colleagues won't let me lie. It's arduous, tiring work that brings many surprises, many of them far from pleasant. I vividly remember that night when I accepted a ride in the Roma neighborhood. I arrived at a deserted street where a person was waiting. When I stopped in front of him, he asked me to wait because he was going to send me with an errand, a package to deliver. At that time, I believe the application didn't have the option to mark it as a delivery. But sometimes these types of services were more manageable. I could drive without the pressure of having a passenger watching every aspect of the journey. The case is that after a couple of minutes waiting with my hazard lights on a few steps from the curb, I saw the requester returning carrying a person. I got out of the vehicle to help him, but immediately felt a bit strange. Transporting a family member isn't necessarily what you call a package delivery. However, when I got closer, I realized I'd been mistaken. In his arms was not a person. It was a human-sized mannequin. I headed toward the back door, but that man performed a maneuver to open the front passenger door himself without my help. He seated the mannequin in the front seat, adjusted its legs, rested its head against the backrest, and without saying anything more, closed the door. Before departing, the only thing he told me was that at the end of the journey, someone would be waiting to receive David. I assumed that was the mannequin's name. I understood that I would follow the route marked on the phone maps, so I turned off the interior light and began the trip in silence. Earlier that day, the sky had been overcast. As night fell, the atmosphere began to feel more humid until the first raindrops started falling. The windows were closed, and joking, I asked the mannequin if it wanted me to turn on the air conditioning, and even kept quiet, waiting for any response. Obviously, nothing happened. Halfway through the journey, a heavy downpour started, evident by the waves of water it dragged across the pavement. I was concentrating on driving, observing all that, and also the empty streets, when suddenly I felt a blast of cold air. The passenger window was half open. Instinctively, I reached for where I thought the door lock and window controls would be, but I received a frightening surprise. At that time, I was driving two cars alternately, one with electric windows and another simpler one with a manual mechanism. The shock came when I realized that we were in the car with the crank to raise and lower the windows, which meant that David had opened the window. The strong wind began to bring rain into the car, forcing me to reach over the mannequin's legs to close the window, always thinking that this was an inanimate object and not a person. But with the growing fear that just as the window had mysteriously lowered, something else would unexpectedly happen. At a red light, I turned on the interior lights and timidly contemplated David's face. It was a plastic mannequin with glass eyes, a checkered shirt and jeans. The expression carved into its face was terrifying. The mannequin seemed to be forcing a smile. What I had beside me was so macabre that I immediately decided to turn off the lights again. In 20 minutes I reached the destination. I distinctly remember that at some point its mere presence began to make me uncomfortable. I didn't want anything more than to arrive quickly and remove that horrifying mannequin from the car. As we approached the end of the journey, I noticed a person waiting under the sidewalk behind a wheelchair and with an umbrella open in their right hand. As I stopped, I turned on the lights and noticed that the mannequin had turned its head, its face facing toward me. I turned on the hazard lights and got out of the car. It was an elderly woman who would receive the package. She expected me to bring David down, so I hurriedly opened the door, placed one hand under its legs and the other behind its back. When I lifted it, I was horrified to feel it was strangely light. I carried it to place in the wheelchair and heard a small "thank you" escape, not from its mouth, but from its chest. I swear I wanted to drop it immediately. When I placed it in the wheelchair, the woman told me that she hoped the trip had been peaceful, as David liked to play tricks. That truly made my skin crawl. Terrified, I got in the car, ended the trip on the application, and drove away with my heart racing until I received the next service request. 2 weeks later, I received another request from the same address in Roma. I almost canceled the trip, but it was a slow night, and I needed the money. When I arrived, the same man was waiting this time with a strange smile. "You came back," he said. "David is very happy to know that. He likes you." When he opened the car door, my heart nearly stopped. In the passenger seat was David, but not as I remembered him. Instead of sitting upright, he was leaning to one side, his head tilted toward the driver's seat. And he was wearing different clothes, a small suit, as if prepared for a special event. "He says you're the best driver he's ever had," the man said. "So he wants you to take him to the ceremony." "What ceremony?" I asked, my throat dry. "My funeral," the man answered, his voice changing, becoming deeper, less human. "And yours." When I looked back, the man had vanished. But in the rearview mirror, I could see someone in the back seat, a tall, thin shadow with deep black eyes and an unnaturally wide smile. Exactly like David's face. That night, as I'm telling you this story, David is sitting in the corner of the room watching me. Every time I mention his name, his head tilts to one side as if listening. And he's smiling, always smiling. I've tried to get rid of him. Last week I drove to the outskirts of the city and left him at a garbage dump. When I returned home that evening, he was sitting on my couch wearing a different outfit, a small raincoat still wet from the afternoon shower. The elderly woman who received him that first night was in the obituaries 3 days ago. Heart failure, the paper said. The man who first gave him to me hasn't been seen in weeks. His apartment is empty. The neighbors say he moved without notice, leaving most of his belongings behind. Last night I woke to find David sitting at the foot of my bed, a small notepad in his lap. When I turned on the light, I saw he was keeping a list of names, the elderly woman, the man who gave him to me and mine, with a question mark beside it. This morning he was gone from the corner where he usually sits. In his place was a small suit my size laid out neatly with a note for the ceremony. I don't know if mannequins can write, but I know David isn't just a mannequin. Whatever inhabits that plastic form has been collecting souls, and I fear mine is next. If you ever receive a ride request in Roma, Mexico City, and someone asks you to transport a mannequin named David, cancel immediately. If you see a human-sized mannequin in a store window that seems to follow you with its glass eyes, walk away quickly. And if you ever wake to find something sitting at the foot of your bed that wasn't there when you fell asleep, don't turn on the light. Some dolls are made to be played with, others are made to play with you. I hear footsteps outside my door now. They're too light to be human. A plastic tap, tap, tap on the wooden floor. The doorknob is turning slowly. David wants to know if I'm ready for the ceremony. I think I always have been. A little girl called. I graduated from the police academy in late 1991. A few months later, I began patrolling the streets. I had little experience and less than a year of service with the force when I was called to handle one of the strangest reports I've ever received in my entire career. A little girl had called the station. She said her father wasn't feeling well, that his extremities were numb, along with an excruciating pain in his throat. The operator that night offered to send an ambulance, but the girl wanted a patrol car, especially because the house door was locked, and there was currently no one who could open it for the medical personnel. The operator informed the little girl that police couldn't force their way into the home and asked her to urge her father or any other adult to facilitate entry for the public servants who were on their way. Besides, the patrol car, an ambulance was dispatched, but we arrived first. We found the entrance gate to the house bent and twisted with a chain embracing both metal leaves, but with a hole where one could enter by squatting. Inside the house there was only one light on. The yard and surrounding areas vibrated with the red and blue lights from the patrol car. Before entering, we rang the doorbell. A little girl's voice over the intercom asked us to come in to follow a small garage and then enter through the back of the house. I always remember that the little girl's words were very eloquent for someone her age. According to the report, she was 7 years old. As we moved toward the inside of the house, the only light that had been on went out. We walked a few meters unable to see our surroundings until the light from a handheld flashlight showed us the way again. The back door made a dreadful noise when we pushed it. It was a kind of storeroom or pantry. We had to navigate past a pile of boxes and garbage bags to make our way into the house proper. We had been announcing our presence since we arrived on the street, first with the patrol car siren, then in the yard and in the house with our voices, but until that moment we still hadn't seen anyone. Based on the condition of the house, the amount of dust on the furniture, the smell of mustiness, dampness, and garbage, our imagination had started to run wild. My colleague and I climbed to the first floor, following the light that had just turned on again coming from a bedroom and partially illuminating the stairs. The house felt so empty it was scary to be there. There was no trace of the little girl who had called the station and had given us instructions through the intercom. Nor was there any indication that anyone else was in the house. Specifically, we were looking for the little girl's father, who, according to our understanding, was feeling unwell. We entered the bedroom and immediately understood what was going on. There was an open window, its curtains fluttering in the wind. From inside the room, a taut rope extended out through this window. We looked out to the garage, and there we found him, a man hanging by a rope around his neck. We had walked directly underneath him when we entered the house, but because it was dark, we couldn't see him. It wasn't the only violent image I'd ever seen in the line of duty, but it was one of the first. And what was completely inexplicable was that when the emergency services arrived, the neighbors were awake, some looking through windows and others out on the street. The testimonies they provided made us tremble with fear. There was no telephone line in that house. No one lived there. We searched for a good while, but found no little girl. The man who had committed suicide seemed to have been trying to squat in the property, because, as I said, this was an abandoned house and no one should have been living there. The cause of death was evidently suicide, though I think a deeper investigation might have yielded some other motive. Of course, this is just speculation because in the police force we don't believe in ghosts. Well, not all of us. In the days that followed, we tried to trace the origin of the call. Mobile phones weren't common in 1992, and as I mentioned, the house had no landline. There was no 7-year-old girl living there. In fact, the house had been abandoned for over a decade following the death of its previous owner. Interviews with neighbors revealed the house had a reputation for being haunted. People reported hearing a little girl's voice late at night, particularly on rainy nights. But what I could never forget was what Diaz, my colleague who was with me that night, shared with me several years later. "I never told you this," he said, "but I saw that little girl. When we were climbing the stairs, I caught a glimpse of her in the hallway. She was about 7 years old, wearing a white dress, and I could see through her as if she were made of smoke." Years have passed, and the case remains unsolved. We never found out who actually called the police station that night. There was no recording of the call. The system had malfunctioned on that particular night. No one knows why the man entered the abandoned house or why he killed himself. Nothing made sense. To this day, the house remains vacant, though it has had various owners over the years. No one stays there for more than a month. The rumor in the neighborhood is that on rainy nights one can hear the voice of a little girl calling for her father, saying he's in trouble. I had never returned to that house until last week, 30 years after the incident, when there was another call from the same address. This time it was a boy about 10 years old, saying his mother wasn't feeling well. When I arrived there, the house looked different, renovated with fresh paint, a family seemingly having moved in. But the familiar feeling of dread returned as I walked through the gate. I knocked on the door, and a woman around 30 years old answered. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked. "We received a call from this address," I explained. "A boy said his mother wasn't feeling well." The woman looked confused. "There are no children here, officer. It's just me and my husband, and he's away on business." "Are you sure the call came from here, no more than 30 minutes ago?" "I'm absolutely certain. We just moved in last week and we don't have children. Actually, I just found out today that I'm pregnant. I haven't even told my husband yet." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'm sorry for the disturbance. Perhaps it was a prank call." As I turned back to my patrol car, I couldn't help but look up. Through a second-floor window, the same room where we found the rope 30 years before, I saw a little boy looking down, his face serious. And beside him, a tall figure with a strange circle around his neck, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. When I reported this to the department, they checked the history of the house. The previous owner, a young man, had hanged himself in the second-floor bedroom, leaving a note that read, "I'm sorry, son, Dad can't stay." The most terrifying connection today, that woman gave birth to a boy. 1 week later, her husband hanged himself in the second-floor bedroom. Last night I drove by the house again. In the second-floor window stood 3 figures, now a little girl, a boy, and a man with a rope around his neck. They all waved as I passed. The dispatch operator who took that call 30 years ago retired last month. At her retirement party, she pulled me aside. "Remember that call?" she asked. "The little girl who reported her father." I nodded, unable to forget. "I never told anyone this," she whispered, but after she gave the address just before hanging up, she said something else. The former operator's face had gone pale with the memory. "What did she say?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "She said, 'He'll be waiting for you too someday.' This morning I received a call from dispatch. A little girl reporting her father wasn't feeling well. The address, my own home, and it's starting to rain. Midnight passengers. It was nearly midnight, and I couldn't stand the hunger anymore. On Mondays at this hour, it's difficult to find an open street food stall, so I had no choice but to search the streets for an orange or green illuminated sign of a convenience store. Making a loop around a small avenue where I knew there were several 24-hour stores in both directions, I stopped at an OXXO. I parked in the last spot where the streetlight didn't reach. I took my time getting out meanwhile, thinking about what I could buy with the pile of coins filling a small compartment beside the seat. I got out and walked toward the entrance, glancing at the refrigerator displaying prepared foods, then looking toward the hot dog and coffee station. After making my purchase, I returned to the taxi, carrying a hot drink, a sandwich, a bag of snacks, and a bottle of water in both hands. Before reaching the car, I thought I saw a man sitting in the back seat. I paused for a moment, considering the possibility of providing service, even though I had planned to stay parked there to eat. Then I approached, looked through the window, and told the passenger I wasn't in service, politely apologizing and asking him to exit the taxi. The man heard me but didn't turn to look. He didn't respond and didn't even look at me. I got into the taxi but had no intention of starting it, and consequently no intention of providing service to the man. When I got in, I placed the hot coffee in the cup holder while looking in the rearview mirror. The man was still there. The second time, I didn't ask, but ordered him to leave the taxi. I turned to look him in the eyes, but then I found the seats empty. I hadn't heard him exit, and I was certain the doors had never opened. I looked around and didn't find him either. The chills running down my neck and back made me wait more than a minute before taking a sip of coffee, until I made sure the car was locked. I opened the sandwich wrapper. When I took the first bite, I looked in the rearview mirror. It was then that I saw him again, the same man standing across the street looking in my direction. I'm very sure I didn't imagine what I saw. I could even swear that the man's feet weren't touching the ground. I dropped the sandwich, and the drink spilled from the cup. My hands shook as I turned the key, starting the engine. I couldn't take my eyes off the man. He remained standing there, looking toward me with a fixed, strange gaze. I turned the car around and drove out of the parking lot, trying not to look back. But when I stopped at the first traffic light, I couldn't help checking the rearview mirror again. The road behind me was empty. I sighed with relief. The light turned green, and I continued driving. After going just 2 blocks, I began to feel cold. I checked the air conditioning. It was off, but the temperature in the car continued to drop until I could see my breath. And then in the corner of my eye movement in the back seat. I didn't dare look directly at it, but through the rearview mirror I saw a shadowy object forming a dark, human-shaped silhouette. Gradually it became clearer until I could recognize that face, the same man from the parking lot. "You forgot to drive me," a voice said, not coming from the back seat, but seeming to originate inside my head. I screamed while slamming on the brakes, causing the car to skid to the side of the road. Fortunately, there were no other cars at this hour. I spun around, ready to face whatever was there, but the back seat was once again empty. My hands trembled as I reached for my mobile phone. I needed to talk to someone just to ensure I was still sane. I called Miguel, another taxi driver who usually worked the night shift. "Miguel, I think I just saw a ghost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where?" he asked, not sounding as surprised as I expected. "First at the Oxo on Reforma, then in my car, a man whose feet didn't touch the ground." Miguel was silent for a moment. "Did you pick up any passengers near there?" "No, why?" "Because there was an accident there about a month ago. A man was hit by a car right outside that Oxo. He was a taxi passenger who had just gotten out when he was hit." My heart pounded. "What did he look like?" "I don't know, I wasn't there, but I heard he was wearing a black coat and he was a foreigner, probably American. The man I saw was wearing a black coat, and he had features unlike most Mexicans." "What day is it today?" Miguel asked. "Monday." "Why?" "The accident happened on a Monday evening. They say he appears at the same time each week, looking for a taxi to take him back to his hotel, a place he never reached." I felt another chill run down my spine. How do I stop it? How do I keep him from appearing in my car? "You can't," Miguel said, his voice dropping. "Once he's chosen your car, he'll stay until you take him where he wants to go." "And where is that?" "I don't know. No one knows. The drivers who have picked him up, they never come back to tell the tale." As Miguel spoke those words, I looked in the rearview mirror once more. The man had returned, sitting upright in the back seat, his eyes meeting mine through the mirror. And this time he was smiling. "I know where I want to go," the voice in my head said, "and I've been waiting for a driver like you for a long time." I could hear Miguel trying to say something through the phone, but I couldn't hear him anymore. All I could hear was the sound of the car engine as it began to move on its own, heading toward a destination only my passenger knew. That night, if you see a yellow taxi driving through the streets of Mexico City at midnight with no driver but with a passenger in the back seat, don't try to stop it. Don't look at the passenger. And whatever you do, never ever invite him into your car. Last week, another taxi driver disappeared. His car was found abandoned near the airport, the engine still running. The only trace was a black coat on the back seat that hadn't been there when he started his shift, according to his wife. The police are baffled, but those of us who drive the midnight streets of Mexico City know the truth. We know about the passenger who appears on Monday nights always looking for a ride to a destination no living driver has ever reached. I'm writing this as a warning. If you're ever taking a taxi in Mexico City and feel a sudden drop in temperature, or if your driver keeps glancing nervously in the rearview mirror at an empty back seat, ask to be let out immediately, no matter where you are. Because some passengers never reach their destination, and some drivers never return from the journey. Tomorrow is Monday, and I'll be driving again. Not because I want to, but because he's waiting for me. I see him sometimes standing outside my window at night, his feet floating inches above the ground, watching me with those hollow eyes. He's chosen my taxi now, and I know deep down that this time I'll complete the journey. This time, I'll take him home.